Larry who? Never heard of her.
What sort of a man is he?
Hick from Bama.
A man like any other, but more so.
I thought he was dead.
This is the Larry Alex Taunton Show. Let's light this candle.
Welcome into the Larry Alex Taunton Show, and I am Larry Alex Taunton. It is great to be with you on this day, and we've got something very special for you on this episode. We're going to be just talking with my three sons about homeschooling. Now, this topic is in the news in a very big way because of what is happening in America's public schools. Well, where children are not being educated, they're being indoctrinated. And so you find that this is a big discussion in the culture. Now, you're not really seeing much about this in major media, but it is a topic of discussion on social media, and that is because many Christians are wondering, what do I do? Not just Christians, by the way. There are many people who are not religious at all who just don't want their children to be Marxists, and they don't want their children to be sexualized and to be, educated by pedophiles. So people are considering options, and among those options, in addition to private schools, independent schools, Christian schools, is home education. And there are a lot of misconceptions about this topic. But, Jason Whitlock of Blaze TV saw that I tweeted about this just a little bit, and he asked me to come on the show to talk about it because he said that, his brother had been considering this. And while neither of them had been homeschooled, they were both now proponents of this as a real option. So I thought that as an aid to a lot of people who are thinking about this, that what they might do is just listen to this podcast, where rather than just listening to parents talk about it, they are listening to products of it. So you guys, you're on trial today. People are paying close attention. They're paying close attention to you, and how you've turned out to be as individuals. But let's begin with
Zach, you need to leave.
Yeah,
let's begin with introductions. We'll start with Michael, who is the oldest. Michael, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, I'm an attorney in Birmingham, Alabama. Generally do corporate litigation, defend companies, often on appeal. I'm a husband of a wonderful wife and father of two children.
Wonderful. You're not defending Disney right now, are you?
No, they're not a client.
Okay, Christopher, you're number two. Why don't you tell us?
I'm a director of community engagement here at Fixed Point. The second of four children here. Recently, I got married, so coming up on a year. And
congratulations!
Thank you.
Your beautiful wife is upstairs somewhere, trying to keep children from making lots of noise.
Mm-hmm. And recently finished up getting my Master of Divinity at Beeson Divinity School.
Very good. And Zachary is the youngest of the trio. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I run a startup in Birmingham now. I've been doing that for a little over 4 years. I am the father to no children and the husband to no wives, so it's just me and my job.
And I thought you had two.
Well,
no illegitimate children.
None.
And
that we know
you say
of.
a startup. What kind of? You're already getting a feel for these characters, but what kind of startup?
So it's a social media marketing startup, but really we work in the creator economy space with like influencers on YouTube and Instagram.
We'll come back to this a little bit later. What is the name of this startup?
Embassy Social.
So I see that you're well branded today.
Gotta be.
Yes,
Gotta be.
You're getting a little bit of your brand out there.
Product placement.
Product placement today, guys. Let's start with this discussion. Michael, let me first set this up. About how we got here. Now, if any defects in my logic, to those of you who are listening, those on the left who wish to attack me, just know that I'm a product of public schools primarily, so it's your fault. But I also went to a private school, and I think the mentality of most parents is what I had is good enough for my children. And homeschooling, when Michael was born in 88, Homeschooling was not really a thing at the time. And we were already starting to see some of the nonsense, in public schools at that time. I say starting to see it. It had been around for quite some time. Nothing on the scale of what we're seeing now. But this kind of nonsense was going on at the time. And Lori, my wife, when Michael's about 5, she says to me that she's interested in homeschooling. Now, to me, that sounded Branch Davidian. I just thought this sounds bizarre. It sounds weird. It sounds cultish, because I didn't know anybody who homeschooled. And she just systematically demolished every objection that I had to it by simply pointing out that, hey, when were you first, exposed to pornography, public school, drugs, Larry, public school, bullying. Oh, well, my older brother, but I get your point. And she just systematically just knocked down every objection that I had to this. And then the data was incredibly impressive, that homeschoolers were outpacing every other educational demographic, regardless of the parents' level of education, which is fascinating to me. So whether or not a father or mother had a college degree, their children were still outpacing in standardized tests. And now, by the way, they're trying to rig the standardized tests with critical race theory, kind of nonsense in order,
or just abolish them,
to make it, so that kids who are coming out of, Christian schools or home education don't know the answers to these kinds of questions. Anyway, this has nothing to do with actual education, but all of that said, the data was incredibly impressive. And I was seeing that Ivy League schools were actively seeking homeschool kids at the time because they had a tendency to excel. And, the most common objection is socialization. I love what Steve Jobs said. Steve Jobs, commenting on home education, said, Abraham Lincoln was home educated, and he turned out to be kind of interesting. So we decided to do it. I told Lori she had a year. We'd start Michael a year earlier. We thought he was ready. He was a precocious first child, as first children often are. And I loved it. I thought this is working. I love how family life is central here. That rather than our lives revolving around the school, school revolves around our life. So, Michael, let's begin with you. As a product of homeschooling, when you look back, what did you think of your teachers?
It's a mixed bag. It's
Tread
a mixed
lightly.
bag. I'd really have to sit and think about each individual one. No, it was great. It was a great experience. So I obviously, individually, I split between homeschooling and I was in a private school as well. But I thought, homeschooling gave you an opportunity to really focus on your strengths. Your weaknesses are gonna be something that you get more individualized tutoring on if you need, and you can move at your own pace. You think of how much time, and I think some parents have realized this actually during COVID, is they've been forced to do some homeschooling. And one of the things that I've heard repeatedly from parents is realizing how much dead time is actually in the school day.
Built into it. So if your school day, we would be done when?
Oftentimes noon, 1 o'clock. You're talking about, particularly when you're younger, 3 hours of school. And when you get older, maybe 5.
It's interesting because the harder part, I think, from a parental point of view of homeschooling is until the children learn to read. Once they learn to read, they can do an awful lot individually. So your mom could say to you, Michael, I want you to read this story. I'm going to start the timer and go do the laundry and then come back. But they can do a little bit more on their own when they are old enough to read. Christopher, you were next. You came along. By this time, we had a little bit of experience with Michael, knew what we were doing. As you reflect on your homeschool experience, what do you think?
Yeah, I loved it. I learned a lot. I enjoyed especially the reading part. Like one thing that I love, because I remember like mom sometimes would even like
Zachary has the Rona.
the Black Plague.
He's
I promise I don't.
Mask up.
Zachary has the Rona over here, and he's dying. But these seasonal allergies or something are killing him over here. But anyway, go ahead,
With a
Chris.
Taunton cough, as we call it.
Yeah, the dreaded Taunton cough is actually the Henderson cough because it came from my mom's side of the family. I just want to be clear. Anyway, go ahead.
But yeah, I mean, I always enjoyed it. I remember sometimes even mom would, I don't know how to say, bribe us even and say like, hey, you can do 2 days of school today and take tomorrow off sometimes. And so we'd be like, oh, awesome. We'd have that incentive. So we would do double time and like do extra math and do extra reading and so on. And then, we'd have some time. But I don't know. I think what I love also about homeschooling is that you can get creative with it. Like you might think, well, I'm not really great at science, let's say, or whatever. It's like, just because you're homeschooling doesn't mean you can't bring in some extra help. Like maybe you have a friend who's really good at science, or you have a grandparent or whatever. Like you can be creative, and now there's YouTube videos on everything. And so I don't know. The point is I love that you and mom were creative with how we did it. We would have like some sort of homeschooling curriculum, but often y'all would change it up a little bit, and you would assign like crime and punishment and, or whatever, and say like, I want you to do a reading course that I assign you the readings, and you do some essays. So
Yeah, and when we started with Michael, there were a very limited number of curricula that were available, and now it's incredible how much is available to parents. Just as you say, so much that is available online, whether it's on YouTube or it's Zoom or Skype meetings with tutors and things of that nature. You just reminded me, I hired Phil Mulkey. Do you remember Phil Mulkey?
Yes.
Oh yes,
For sure.
Phil Mulkey. Do you remember Phil Mulkey?
I do. I was actually thinking about Phil Mulkey like 2 days ago. No kidding.
Tell everybody who Phil Mulkey is, Zachary.
So Phil Mulkey was the track coach at Altamont, right?
Yes.
And he was a friend of yours who you essentially got to run our PE classes, and so we ran under Phil Mulkey, and we timed miles, we did all the good stuff with him. But he was a hard driving guy.
Do you know his background?
He was in
He's
his.
an
He was in
Olympian
his. So he
something.
was. Yeah, he was my gym teacher when I was in private school, and so because I did 2 stints with homeschooling, once through about 5th grade, and then high school, and so he had been my gym teacher at Altamont. But he was a former Olympian. I believe had a military background. And he was in his late 70s.
It's still kicking.
Yeah,
Guy's still going.
More than that, I mean, I remember on his 75th birthday, him sitting down and doing 75 push-ups in front of us, and standing up and saying, "Man, when I reach 80, this is going to be a." Let you fill in the blank.
Yeah, Mulkey. Yes, he was a former Olympian. I think he was in maybe the '64 or '68 Olympics. The decathlon. He was once the world record holder. And I love Phil. Phil's such a character, but I thought, these boys, they need, I can give them, some outdoor and, physical education, let them get out and play and this sort of thing. But I wanted something more formalized. And I thought, Phil will do this. And I remember him saying to you boys, you were complaining that you were tired, you couldn't run. And he said, well, I reckon if an Al-Qaeda jumped down behind you with an AK-47, you would run.
He would have been the guy to carry it too. Just
There
make
you
you
go.
do it. He was one of those sort of old school gym teachers that if he looked at you and said "good job," that really meant something.
Yeah, that's
Because you didn't get a lot of that, but when you did, it meant something.
I remember him calling us over, and he's like, "Feel my abs." And he was like, "Rock hard, right?" And he was like, "Y'all are gonna have that when I'm done with you."
Phil is a great human being. But the point here being that it wasn't simply that your mother and I knew absolutely every subject. You could get, people, but especially by the time Zachary came along, there was beginning to be, more opportunities.
And co-ops, I mean, a huge thing that tons of homeschoolers take advantage of now, which did not exist when we were growing up, is the co-op model.
Yeah.
Which sort of stemmed from, as my understanding is, you're a history teacher, she's a science teacher. How about you? I'll teach your kids history, you teach my kids science. And eventually that kind of blossomed into what is kind of a hybrid model. Where 75% of the work is done at home, and then 25% of the work is done in sort of a classroom with hired tutors.
Yeah, and that works beautifully. And some people would say, well, now you're really starting to create a school. Well, that's okay, because you're now doing it with people that you really, really trust, that you have some control over this, what it looks like. And one of the things that I thought
And there's
was
still tons of flexibility.
huge
Tons of
flexibility.
flexibility. Even with the co-op model, there's still tons of flexibility.
One of the things that I thought was really wonderful and maybe because now we put you into a private school from 5th through 9th grade, is that right?
That's right.
So I wanted Michael to get some Latin. At the time, I was teaching in a private school, therefore I had some control over who you had and where you went, and I could rig your class schedule just a little bit, and we felt like that would be good for you, and we felt like you were ready for that. But one of the things that I really thought was wonderful, and maybe, I don't know, maybe not, but perhaps you three guys all take this for granted because you don't really know anything different. But as a bit of an academic and doing a lot of research and writing and this sort of thing, we could turn the world into our classroom and take you guys all over the world. Talk about that experience.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's one of those things that I realized after I got, because when you're homeschooled, you don't necessarily get a sense of perspective on what other kids' education is actually looking like. And it wasn't until after I graduated high school and was in college at Samford that I started to realize how unique my experience had actually been. It's because by the time I'd graduated high school, I'd probably been out of the country 24 times to, 12, 15 countries.
Yeah, where are some of the places you went?
So, yeah, France, Germany, England, Scotland, Australia, Ukraine 3 times, Moldova, just kind of all over the place.
South America.
Yeah, South America. And then
medical missions.
That's right, yeah, Peru in there. And so when I got to college, obviously, I knew that was, different, but I didn't really have a real concept for how different it was until I got around people who'd never left the country at all. And they might have even come from wealthier backgrounds or whatever.
Occasionally, it only left 2 states.
Right. Yeah. And for me, it quickly showed me that there's a lot more to education than simply the facts that you learn. It's about the way your thinking is framed. And so coming out, with so much travel experience already, I found that I was, saw the world as a more open doored place that I could navigate. And a lot of kids, they just had no concept of it. They might, have had decent test scores, but when it actually came down to world experience, it was just a void.
Well, I saw a tremendous opportunity to get you guys involved, and I very much believe, ladies and gentlemen, there is, and I think it's largely a 20th century model, this idea that kids are allowed to kind of not be contributors in ministry, in community, in anything until maybe they're 30 years of age, and up to that point, they're consumers. Lori and I took the view that our children, that there would be an expectation that you have responsibilities and that you are engaged in ministry from the get-go. And that might be just handing out, leaflets or bulletins at church or at one of our events or anything like that. But I think of this because I took all of you on trips that are related to the nonprofit that I direct, Fixed Point Foundation. Those of you who are watching are probably familiar with Fixed Point, if only because you're watching the Fixed Point Hour, right now on DirecTV, but also because, there you go, right there, but because you would be aware of our Super Bowl commercial, perhaps, or you are aware of some of our debates. But I'm mindful of Zachary. Had Zachary at the Edinburgh International Festival, where we were doing a debate with famed Oxford atheist biologist. We weren't debating him. He was coming. Yeah. Richard Dawkins. He was coming to debate. It was a debate that we had put on there along with Trinity Forum between Christopher Hitchens, also an Oxonian and a well-known atheist, though a journalist, and between him and Dr. John Lennox, Professor John Lennox of Oxford University. In any case, I am before the event getting all the cameras, set up, and this is what I want, and this is what I want, and people are starting to file in, and I say to Zachary, who had been around, Dawkins, many times, as had all of you, and I said, Zachary, it's your job. We hear that Dawkins is coming, and it's your job to find him. And Zachary is wearing his little bow tie, and he's up in the balcony before the event, and all of a sudden I hear, "There he is!" And Zachary is pointing at him from up in the balcony, and I go over
Real
to
subtle. Zach.
Yeah, I like discretion in that moment.
and I go over to the cameraman and I say, "Hey, get a shot here of Professor Dawkins in the audience." It's funny because Hitchens saw you with your tie, and he saw that you were wearing black watch.
Black watch, yep.
And he says, "A fighting man, I see." Anyway, the others of you on your travel experience.
Well, so I was going to say, actually, most of my travel experience was actually through the private school, because you would lead tours abroad, and I often would get to go on those. The travel days at Fixed Point really didn't come along until I was already in college, and so that wasn't as much an opportunity. But playing off of what you had mentioned about being involved and being a producer, not a consumer, actually my experience on that would be in high school. In a lot of ways, I was kind of, I guess, the first employee of Fixed Point, and particularly putting together those kind of like this, though we didn't have equipment nearly this fancy back in those days. But putting together talks, burning them indivially on the computer,
CDs,
on the CDs, and we did some travel, as you were speaking and things like that, and running the resource table and handing those out or selling them or whatever it might be, and so certainly had lots of exposure.
Then
lots
the
of experience.
PCA, General Assembly down in Orlando. That was so funny.
That was a ton of fun. That was fun.
And
you guys worked that table, worked the Fixed Point table, and were in the convention center, convention hall, and that was very funny.
But all of that was possible because, oftentimes those were engagements that were over lunch. They were in the middle of the day. There are times where if I'd been at school, then, that wouldn't have been happening.
Well, our Latimer House Luncheon Series, you could get involved in that. When I was doing, I won a fellowship. And, Lori and I got married at 19, and Michael was born at 21. So I was still going through college, when Michael came along, and I won a fellowship. And Michael was a lad who had enough money to take Michael along with me, and I was doing research on the intellectual origins of the Holocaust. And so Michael was with me as I'm going to Buchenwald and to Dachau and did we go to Mittelbau-Dora? I think I did.
Yep.
I think I took you to Mittelbau-Dora, and we had some funny,
Mauthausen.
Yeah, Mauthausen is not funny, but we had rented a Skoda. And you get out on the Autobahn, and you think you're doing something at 100, 110 miles per hour. These big Mercedes, get behind us and flash their lights.
Get out of the way.
Get out of the way. But Michael was along for all that. And our thinking with each of you was we wanted to bring you alongside, because part of equipping a child, Psalm 127 says that children are like arrows in the hands of a warrior. And our thinking with our children is that we were going to sharpen them, and when you were ready, we were going to pull you from the quiver and aim you at a wicked world where you would be salt and light. And actually what is happening right now in public schools is the very opposite, is that many Christians, many people, their own children are being sharpened into arrows against them, so that you have so many parents who are discovering that their children hold ideas that are very hostile to them. Thanksgiving and Christmas are not stressful in our household because in addition to sharing the same a wonderful football team,
Roll Tide.
we also share the same, largely the same political opinions, worldview. So disagreements don't come down to those kinds of things. But it was important because we felt like we could get you guys engaged and involved and exposed to the world as we kind of held your hand and exposed you to it. I remember you being with me when we went to Richard Dawkins' house. And I called you my Sherpa. You were carrying all my equipment, and we went there. But you got to sit there at the feet of guys like Dawkins and John Lennox and Christopher Hitchens and all these different debates and conversations that I'm having. you're right there as a part of this, and you're getting to travel the world. All three of you were at Oxford University. You were at Oxford, yes, when I was there for the summer.
For the summer, we were all three.
Yeah,
I
we
think
were all.
I think it was like 3 for that.
Yeah, okay.
He was tiny, but he was
He was a little, but you were there, and you got that exposure. And of course, later when you're a little older, as we mentioned, the Edinburgh International Festival and all over the place. So these were wonderful experiences for you. Now, I know many people who are listening are going, I don't have those opportunities to do that with my kids. Your kids having the opportunity to just see you engage the world. That's the way children learn, is to see how mom and dad do it. There will be people who say, I don't think you can shelter your kids. Parents, that's your job. That is a central part of your job description, is to shelter your kids from a very wicked world, gradually exposing them to it at your direction. You're the filter, helping them to understand all that they're seeing, and when the time comes, you set them loose into the world. Christopher, you got some interesting travel experiences too.
Oh, for sure. I mean, yeah, that especially when a lot of those debates were taking off. I got to come to Oxford that one time when we did the Lennox Dawkins debate. The second one, has science buried God? And
I quote you in The Grace Effect talking about that.
yeah, that's right. That was a really interesting experience in the natural science or the Museum of Natural History.
Yes.
Really enjoyed that. I remember I was reading at the time the Fellowship of the Ring, and it felt really cool reading the Fellowship of the Ring in England. And but I remember sitting in a lobby listening to the Kentucky-Alabama game over the radio, where
Yeah, I'd forgotten about
hovered
that.
over
I'd
the
forgotten that.
radio. But yeah, I mean, great experiences traveling. And then I remember we went on that Reformation tour that you led, sort of some parents from the private school where you worked, and we got to come along to France and Germany and see Wartburg Castle and go to Strasbourg and
Erfurt.
Yeah, Erfurt.
Yeah, that was interesting. Things related largely to John Calvin and Martin Luther. That was a very interesting trip with a translator, the guy named Andreas. Wasn't that his name? He was a real character. But we're going to take a break right now. We will be back in just a moment on the Larry Alex Taunton Show.
This is the Larry Alex Taunton Show.
Welcome back to the Larry Alex Taunton Show. I'm sitting here with my 3 sons, Michael, Christopher, and Zachary, and we're talking about homeschooling. Guys, let's just transition to a slightly different aspect of home education. All of you went to college on scholarships. Did you find yourself getting there and being unprepared?
No.
Nope, quite the opposite.
No. I feared that I would, because it's you're one. I mean, people talk about that. They're like, you're not used to the classroom setting and all of that, and so there was a little trepidation. But yeah, once I got in there,
I actually remember that because you had, as I recall, no classroom experience. You had some with co-op. I had private school, and it took you 2 weeks to adjust?
Yeah, if that.
Yeah,
if that.
Maybe a day or two.
I mean, but I think also.
So you didn't think you needed 12 years of sitting in a public school
No.
desk?
In fact, my professors kept having to, they'd, be like, somebody besides Chris talk, so.
Well, no, I found that the gulf there was especially huge around writing. It's because so much of what we were doing early on in college, for me anyway, was a lot of writing, and you prepared us so well to write. Then when we got in there, I found that I was leaps and bounds ahead of where other people were who seemed to have never really written that much.
And speaking, because so much of college revolves around more of a seminar style, particularly if you're not sitting in the big stadium seats, and in a classroom, it can be easy to sit in the back and not say anything. In fact, a lot of students, that's pretty much what they do for 12 years.
In college, in the public school experience, you learn how to do that very well.
It turns out in homeschooling, it's kind of difficult to hide from the teacher.
You're pretty visible, and so you end up having to do a fair
Let's
bit of
see,
talking.
Michael.
Yeah, it's a classroom of one. What are you going to do?
It is pretty hard to hide in that kind of setting. So you felt like you were all well prepared.
For sure.
Intellectually, you were well prepared.
Exceptionally.
Yeah. Being taught how to critically think. I mean, that was one of the things that you definitely. I mean, it's not that nobody, But like there were a lot of people, they just regurgitate, this book or that book or this, expert or that expert. And you're just wanting to know, well, what do you think?
Yeah.
And it just feels like if they don't have these experts to rely on or whatever, that they can't regurgitate what they hear their professors say or so on. They don't.
And more than that, you'd mentioned earlier, sheltering and exposure, and obviously that's one of the things that gets brought against homeschoolers, right? You're just sheltered, you don't know anything. Certainly there can be some elements of that from time to time, but from an intellectual standpoint, looking at it from an intellectual standpoint, I would say, at least if you're doing your job right as the teacher, and as you and Mom did, I wouldn't say we were sheltered. We had been exposed very, very broadly, to a wide range of philosophies and worldviews and ideas ideas of all types. So that when we're encountering them in college, it's not the first time we've seen these things. And I felt that particularly, some good kids from maybe more like the public schools you grew up in, more rural, a little bit more traditional, but often they were very sheltered.
Yeah.
And they're encountering these things for the first time in college, and they don't know what to do. Right. Where you would expect that to be the homeschooler. No, I'd seen it all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we had we made a point of exposing you to as many worldviews, but also just by doing things like watching a movie with you, and I pause it and say, now what's wrong with what's being pushed here? Or doing that with commercials. What philosophy is being pushed here? And I think you probably know exactly where I'm going with this story. Zachary does. It was so funny because Saab, which is out of business now, but they had a commercial.
Probably because of that commercial, honestly. Yeah.
Saab, because they kept comparing their cars to jets.
Yeah, well, there we go. Well, Saab, the automotive manufacturer of yesteryear, but they had a commercial back in the early 2000s, I guess it is, and there's no narration. It's just music and a beautiful couple in a Saab convertible winding their way down what appears to be the California coast, waves crashing into the rocks and beautiful weather, and the birds are singing and the wind is flowing through their hair. And he looks over at her and she looks at him with this very sexy, kind of look. And she begins taking off one article of clothing after the other. And she holds them up in the wind, catches them as they go. And he's kind of looking. And then the camera pans out and it goes, sob. And, so I would say to you boys, what's being promoted here? What worldview is in this? Well, to show you the power of advertising, it couldn't have been 6 months later that I get a call from Michael saying, Dad,
it had nothing to do with that commercial. Nothing to do.
I get a sob. And I was like, no.
My car had been totaled.
Yes.
In a car wreck that
all
was,
right.
Somebody backed into my car, and it had totaled the car, and I had driven a Saab convertible, first convertible I had driven, and it was a blast.
It had nothing to do with his hope that beautiful women would be taking their clothes off in his car.
Well, I did take Camille for a test drive in it, but no, that didn't happen.
Well, I will not ask Camille his wife, what happened on that particular trip down Highway 31. But in any case, we exposed you. Now, here I am coughing.
Got him.
We exposed you to different worldviews through the everyday, just by asking you to process what is being promoted in a film, what's being promoted in a commercial, in a magazine advertisement. What philosophy is there, and how does it compare to a biblical worldview? So we wanted to train you up, as the Apostle Paul says, to demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of Christ. So you felt like you were prepared intellectually when you went to college. How about from the major arguments that's used against homeschooling is what? Socialization.
Yeah.
Were you guys extremely awkward and unable to get along in college?
Totally.
No. I mean, to be fair, I know where that argument comes from. I've met those kids. I'm not going to say that they don't ever exist. And you do have to work a little bit harder at socialization, but it's not that difficult. I mean, we had tons of friends growing up, usually through church, particularly if you're working through a co-op or something these days, you're going to get some of that naturally through the schooling that you're doing.
And when you were old enough, we got you jobs and whatnot.
So I mean, it's not hard to get
Well,
that
and
exposure and do
let's-
that, and it's in a more controlled environment where less bad things happen.
And let's be clear, there are plenty of, I mean, if we're going to have the socialization argument, are we really going to argue that public schools is the place to be? How many weird kids do you meet coming out of public schools who are absolute social disasters? The ranks of Antifa and Black Lives Matter are filled with public school products. So please don't use the socialization argument. It's absolutely absurd. But
And
anyway,
I would say,
Go ahead.
I would say that there's just like with public school or whatever, with private school or where there's a very broad spectrum and you're dealing with all sorts of people and so on. With homeschooling, there's a very broad spectrum, and I think that there's the stereotype that really is almost like Hutterite, and you do have that kind of a homeschool.
with all due
homeschooling
respect to
sect.
Hutterites.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well,
But what I'm saying is that a lot of people think that to homeschool, that means that you're just like completely withdrawing from the world, and and that's not.
You've been raised in some kind of monastic, cultish environment. I don't know that image is as prominent as it used to be.
No, it's the image we grew up
Yeah,
with.
it was
well,
the image
I would
that
actually
you-
say
yeah.
that the irony is so many of the kids that I knew who were homeschooled who actually fit that image were kids who had been public schooled first and had been expelled, actually.
Yes.
I knew tons of those kids who were not originally homeschooled but actually had been public schooled first.
So homeschool became
yeah.
a stopgap. It
Right.
was it was
they
a-
had been expelled from public
It
school.
was an emergency
Right.
requirement of kids who were not succeeding in public school and who
Right.
were often victims of it.
And one of the things that I'll say about this, having now a child of my own who is in school and having to work through these things sort of from the other
is
side.
she in a public school?
She's not in a public school, definitely not. But the though we had that conversation too. Camille went to public schools, and so we worked through that too. And it's I mean, I really respect the decision that you and Mom made when you did, because now it is so stark and so obvious that even Camille would say, "Wow, this isn't the school that I went to."
Yeah.
This is completely different than the school that I grew up in.
Well, public schools went. Continue.
What I was going to say on the socialization thing is one of the things that you see is that part of what that means is that by putting a child with their peers sort of extinguish their uniqueness.
Yes.
Keep them from actually pursuing things that naturally they would be inclined to pursue. And it makes everybody the same. It makes everybody sort of pursue the same things, like the same things. That's one of the big things that peer pressure actually accomplishes, right? But that's not necessarily a good thing. Sometimes peer pressure can be a good thing, and if it keeps you from doing really stupid stuff.
Well, I love.
But generally speaking, it sucks the creativity, I
Well,
think, out of children.
I love what Dr. James Dobson said many years ago. This was probably in the 90s. But Dobson had been opposed to homeschool, like, for instance, back in the 70s and into the 80s. And by the 90s, he said, I was wrong. I was wrong. I repent of that. And he became a strong homeschool proponent. And one of the things he said, again, child psychologist, that I think is very interesting, is he said the idea that socialization is important is nonsense, because most of what kids pick up from other kids is unhealthy. You want them modeling adults, meaning oftentimes homeschool kids don't fit in with their public school peers simply by virtue of the fact that they're more mature and they're more interested in serious things. They're not, they're not into the drug culture. They're not as peer dependent. They don't fall into these common categories. And I'm not suggesting, by the way, that every public school a product is a failure. But I am saying that if these days you're putting your kids into public school, you might be part of the problem. When I went to public school, this is interesting. Not by the time you guys came along, this was not true. And hence the reason you didn't go there. I was taught the Lord's Prayer in public school. I was required to learn it. Evangelists.
Very different world.
Yes. evangelists were brought to our school who preached hell every year and had altar calls.
Lawsuits would be filed like that.
In public schools where kids came down the auditorium aisle and gave their life to Christ. Fellowship of Christian Athletes was extremely prominent on campuses. We were taught to love our country. We were taught to be obedient to our parents. Our parents had a real say in what happened in the school. Corporal punishment, which will horrify some of you who are watching and listening, they sent home a sheet of paper at the beginning of every year to ask parents, do you allow us to use corporal punishment on your child? That is to say, to paddle your child. My parents signed that letter every year. And
he has firsthand experience.
I have firsthand experience because I was paddled a lot through school. And for pulling all
every
kinds
year.
of
Oh,
pranks.
they must have signed it again.
Mom and Dad signed that thing every
Gleefully,
time.
I'm sure.
And if you talk back, you could expect a paddling. I recall in grade school, my teacher, she would pull your hand back and take a ruler and whack your hand when you were misbehaving. One time in third grade, famously, my teacher was out of the room, and to amuse the other kids, I got up on her desk and was dancing. When she came into the room, straight to the principal's office, I was paddled again. The principal, Raymond Clark, who called me after The Grace Effect, by the way, came out, my first book, and said to me, I love this book and the man that you've become. I said, Mr. Clark, you paddled me 1,000 times. And he said, and look how you turned out. But it was common in those days. And you guys, when you came along, the public schools had changed radically. And now, from the time you were kids to the way it is now, even more so. We just decided we weren't putting our kids in that environment. We weren't going to do that. And I also want to be clear that I'm not saying that homeschooling is the only option. There are other options, but I want to emphasize to those of you who are listening, who are watching us today, you may think the idea of homeschooling is simply overwhelming to you because it means you're standing in front of a whiteboard every day and your child is sitting there at the kitchen table. This is not what it looks like. You can reach out to us. You can talk to my wife. You reach out to us at Larry Alex Taunton, Taunton, LarryAlexTaunton.com. I'll put you in touch with my wife, who has mentored many a family through the process of homeschooling and what that looks like. But you're all fine young men. You're not perfect young men, but you are fine young men who are all quite successful in your own endeavors.
And to your point that there are other options. I was talking with somebody about this, I don't know, maybe a year ago, and I look at it this way. At the end of the day, education, a child's education, is primarily moral and spiritual, not just mechanical. And the left actually has figured this out.
Yes.
They are very much about this.
Sharpening the arrows against parents.
And
yes.
so, but the education is primarily moral and spiritual. And if you believe that, we should want better for our kids than simply that they not be assaulted.
Yeah.
Which I feel like is frankly
setting the bar pretty low.
That's it is, and it's I just want them to go to a school where they won't be assaulted. And well, no, you want them to go to a school where these things will be actively inculcated,
where they're fortified morally,
and
spiritually.
There are plenty of options available where that may be the case, but that has to be the mindset. That has to be the way you think about it. And where are you accomplishing that best? Certainly, one of the places you accomplish it is in home.
So, you felt yourselves well prepared intellectually, spiritually, socially. Christopher, you felt like that?
No doubt. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I really enjoyed college, made a lot of friends, and all through homeschooling, like we were very active in our church. I had friends in public school, private school, homeschool. I had friends across the board, and we would hang out, spend the night at each other's houses, play video games, whatever. Like go on, family trips, this sort of thing. So never felt like there was anything lacking in that.
Well, okay, I was gonna say on the socialization side of things, like I feel like socialization is in a lot of ways the wrong word, because it is true that if you're homeschooled, that you're going to stand out or from your peers once you get to college or wherever else. But the primary way that ends up being true is really on like pop culture is, for me, the place where I would say I felt it the most. And it was not something that I really wanted to change.
You mean because you weren't a
Yeah,
Backstreet Boys groupie or something
Yeah,
like
it's
that?
because everything they were talking about,
Christopher
I
West.
frankly didn't relate to. Yeah. It's like everything they were talking about, I did not relate to. But at the very beginning of experiencing that, you can be like, dang, I wish I was involved in that. And then after about an hour of listening, you're like, no, this is actually
Do you really miss
dumb. Like, I don't
the
want to
Backstreet
actually,
Boys?
it's like, I don't actually like want to relate to this, because you grow up with such a different experience that it is difficult to fit in initially, but you can pretty quickly realize that that's a positive thing, not a negative one. And it's because it's what makes you think about the world more critically.
Very, very, very quickly, so that our listeners get an idea for what happened with each of you post-college. So all of you got your college degrees. And after you graduated from college with a degree in what, Michael? What was your degree?
I got a degree in classics,
Which means?
Greek and Latin mostly, history, philosophy, and language.
And so...
Nerd.
Which was one of the things I got tutoring in high school while I was homeschooled.
Okay. So what did you do after college?
Well, I took a year, worked for Fixed Point, worked as a barista, waited. My wife
Fancy way of saying a guy who makes your coffee, but anyway, go ahead.
We waited for my wife to finish college. We got married, and then I went to Yale Law School.
Okay.
She went with me.
So, looking at that whole process, thinking what that would be like, I have a lot of friends who are lawyers. And I thought Michael has a good mind for law, and they set up an internship for you, and you decided this was a world that you could move in, and felt like you could probably do fairly well. Took the LSAT, blew the
Particularly once the test scores rolled in, there were a lot of internship offers.
a lot of internship offers, and so you headed off to Yale Law. The Yale Law experience. Just briefly, did you find that was very corrosive to your Christian worldview?
No. And in fact, it's funny. I've talked about this before, but I kind of went in with my fists up, expecting that it was going to be very hostile and such, and quickly kind of started pulling them down as I realized, and this is just a different conversation about the Ivy League, but the Ivy League was so far post-Christian.
Yeah.
That when I came in, they almost didn't even know how to engage me.
Yeah,
it was
an evangelical in their midst.
When people saw me, they kind of eyed you as a curiosity. Like I thought dinosaurs were extinct. Where did this one come from? And so I felt in some ways a little bit like a museum piece. Me and the 5 others in my class who actually would claim some kind of faith, and. I found that in a lot of ways it was very fertile ground. It was very challenging from the perspective of trying to get into the mind of the way they thought, the way they filtered the world, which again was so post-Christian that sometimes you had to really kind of step back and how am I going to engage here? But fascinating experience.
And interesting from the standpoint that you were well prepared to defend your faith in this environment. Yale Law, just to be clear, is so far to the left. They are the engineers of some of the radicalism that we're seeing in the culture right now.
Often.
Very often. And so you may wonder, why would
I was talking about critical race theory about 5 years before everybody else and saying, this is the next thing.
Yeah, and you were. You absolutely were. You were talking about before I'd heard of it. Yeah. And so it was from you that I first heard about this. But it was interesting because some of you may wonder, well, why would you want your Christian child, to go to a place like Yale Law, to be equipped by the Babylonians like Daniel, to use their own arguments against them. Christopher, how about you? What happened to you after you graduated? First of all, what was your degree in?
Also a classics major. So in my case, because I already had in mind that I wanted to go to seminary, I didn't really love the religion department. And so the classics department, I took Greek, I took Latin, but I thought it would just be a good leg up. And honestly, yeah, I just really loved it. Loved my teachers there. But
big difference between the religion department and the divinity school at Stanford University.
Oh yeah,
huge.
They're polar opposites.
So you went there and you
then I went on.
I got a D-Min. No, excuse me. You got an MDiv. Excuse me.
MDiv.
Master's of Divinity.
Yeah, MDiv, and worked. Yeah, I mean, sometime as
You didn't want to say a barista like him?
Well, I did. I worked as a barista some at, and then
Fancy coffee maker.
But I also was a youth.
I can make some.
I was a
very
youth
fancy
director. I was a youth director for a couple of years, and then came and been working with Fixed Point.
And you were ordained.
Yeah, ordained in the Southern Baptist Church, and also just had a cool opportunity to write a book. So.
Yes, you did. The Bew White story, which you can find on Amazon. Find retailers everywhere. Yes, Christopher wrote that biography, a great experience for him. Zachary, how about you? What did you get your degree in? You went as
Did you
part
get
of the
a degree?
I did.
You were part of the fellows program at Stanford University.
I was.
And what did you get your degree in?
Marketing.
Marketing.
Got my degree in marketing and then started my business now, my last semester of senior year.
Okay. And what does that business look like? What is it?
So it's social media marketing through social media influencers. So, people with giant audiences on Instagram or YouTube get brand deals to promote a product. And it's a very large industry, but an inefficient one. And so we step in and fill that gap so that brands can pay for sponsorships through us.
And this is an app?
That's an app. That's right.
So would the average person download this from the App Store or not?
They could. The average person probably wouldn't. No.
So
no, it's aimed at
designed for influencers.
Right. Influencers and then brands. That's right.
Very good. Now, in our remaining 6 minutes, guys, what in the world is happening that so many of your generation are what people call woke? Let's start with you, Chris. What's going on there?
That they're woke. I mean, you have all kinds of. Can you rephrase the question?
Well, jump in here, guys. Help him. I mean, what's going on with?
I mean, I think there's a few things. One is what we've been talking about, right? I mean, is education. And I mean, if you ship your kids off to school and you allow them to be educated by somebody else who doesn't share your values for 8 hours a day, and you spend 30 minutes with them in the evenings, you shouldn't be that surprised when they end up reflecting the values of the school they attend rather than yours. So I think that's a big part of it. Another part of it, I think, is that, and part of the way we were taught, I think a lot of it has, where people started really paying attention to woke is on sort of homosexual issues, transgender issues, these kinds of things. And where did that come from? I think a part of it is growing up, your generation, I feel like, was taught the stories of the founding and World War II, and that was your mentality. Those were your heroes. We were taught the civil rights movement, which is certainly worth studying. But and is wonderful thing to have, but taught it from a very secular perspective, not from the Christian engine that was driving it. And so I know so many people who came out and thought, well, I want to be part of the next civil rights movement. Where's that civil rights movement?
You've made an interesting comment about this, but go ahead.
And so sort of grafted onto actually sexual rights issues as this is our civil rights movement.
The fight of the day. How about you, Zachary? What do you think?
Well, I think in a lot of ways it does just boil down in some way to a failure of education, because education's purpose should be to teach people to think, not to teach them what to think. Mm-hmm. And so many of my peers I've encountered, I discovered really had never been forced to make their own decisions. And so most of the things that they would be fed, they would just accept as gospel truth. And then you pair that with the fact that I think honestly the church has been really heavily infiltrated by this, and has exchanged an ultimate truth in what's right and wrong for the gospel of just being nice. And so if you say something that's not nice anymore, suddenly you're the bad guy. So the new truth is simply being nice to everybody.
Being liked.
Yeah, that's right. And I know so many Christians who think this way, that, we just need to be nice. And I'm like, well, that's not actually what your call is to stand for
Although
truth.
Christians conflate and say, that's being loving.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I blanked it at first because I was messing with the sound levels here. But I do think definitely with like our generation, there's been a lot of like where I first sort of started seeing what's become what we would call woke is this sort of, they would say like our generation about our parents' generation, this lack of inclusivity where, that it's not, the church isn't loving, or, Christians aren't loving enough. And so where, and
Meaning
this is,
that we say some controversial things. That's usually what that means.
this is a victory. This is a victory, of course, with academia right now, with the left and so on, where they framed it as, look at how, controversial, how unloving you're being towards like homosexuals, towards minorities, and so on. And where our generation, which is one, I've been inculcated by public school, by academia right now, is absolutely bought into that and felt, sort of this victimization, and they're like, the church is so, unloving towards these people, and it would just be so much easier. Why can't we be more inclusive?
You made a comment on one occasion that your generation, something to this effect.
The story.
That your generation, repeat that.
I think this is a product of the social media age has really made a lot of this way worse, and it's because we are such a privileged and entitled generation that everything's been handed to, that in the absence of any real struggle, we're just inventing them at this point. And people want so badly to be a part of some story and some drama that they can't find, that they're just creating one. And so, talking about civil rights.
So
right?
they move immediately to Ukraine. And
Exactly.
That's my new.
Everything. It's just like, and a lot of it is, just the sense of virtue signaling. But it's like, hey, we don't have a real civil rights movement going on right now, so we're going to equate everything that doesn't really matter in our lives and act like it's a civil rights movement.
Okay.
And in a lot of ways, first of all, that's just an insult to the real civil rights movement.
Yeah.
It absolutely is.
But like, I had so many of my classmates who came in. Actually, the ones who I worried for the most were the ones who we talked about earlier, who were the ones who were sheltered out of a small town, who'd never really encountered views opposed to their own, and would get into a university setting and just get demolished. And they're the ones who would most often leave trumpeting every cause known to man. Right, whatever the new thing is that the left is pushing so emotionally is now their new truth, and it changes almost every month. And it's just because it's like this, I want to be a part of a drama now.
You have what you have is so now I'm all in on Black Lives Matter. So I have a fist as my as my avatar, and then I go from that to some kind of thing about transgenderism, and then I place my Ukrainian flag up there as an avatar. They just keep going from one thing
Post
to
your
the
black
next.
square, people.
Yes, everybody is getting out there, getting their own story out there. Guys, we've got about 45 seconds left. Anything you'd like to add quickly?
I was just going to say, on that, lost my train of thought. Nope.
Okay.
Got nothing.
Strong ending there, Michael.
Very, very strong
Train of
ending.
thought.
Well, it has been a pleasure to have all of you on the show today. And you can find our show everywhere. You can find it on Apple Podcasts. You can find us on YouTube. You can find us on Rumble, you name it. And look for us at LarryAlexTaunton.com, where every show is archived. It's great to be with you today, ladies and gentlemen. Please tune in with us next time.
Turn out the lights, the party's over. They say that all.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are grateful for the standing ovation, but there will be no encore for today's performance. Please exit the building in an orderly fashion. Thank you.
Honey, can we leave now?